When life becomes heavy, when problems pile up like dark clouds before a storm, the first battle is never fought outside. It's not against your job, your bank account, or even the people who misunderstand you. The first battlefield is always within your own mind. Think about it. When something happens, a broken promise, a sudden bill, an unexpected illness, where does the pain strike first? Not in the outside world, but in that voice inside your head that says, "I can't handle this, everything is falling apart." That voice is restless. It spins, it exaggerates, it predicts disasters that may never come. The Buddha understood this deeply. He once said, "We are shaped by our thoughts, we become what we think." When the mind is pure, joy follows like a shadow that never leaves. What does that mean for us? It means that suffering isn't only about circumstances. It's about the way our mind interprets them, how it holds onto them, how it creates endless stories around them. Imagine your mind like a battlefield. On one side, there's fear, doubt, and worry, armed with endless weapons. What if I fail? What if I lose everything? What if I'm not enough? On the other side, there's clarity, courage, and wisdom, quiet, steady, and often overlooked. Most of the time, fear and worry seem louder, more aggressive, and we surrender without even realizing there's another army inside us that can lead us to peace. Have you ever noticed that the worst things you feared rarely happened exactly as you imagined? Yet your mind kept you awake at night, running endless scenarios. The body stayed tense, the stomach tight, the heart racing, as if those disasters were already real. That is the power of the mind. It can create suffering without any physical event. It can trap you in battles that don't even exist outside of thought. But here's the truth. Your thoughts are not reality. They are like clouds drifting across the sky, shapes that come and go but never define the vastness of the sky itself. You are that sky, you are not the storm. So how do we begin to step out of this battlefield? The first step is awareness. Notice the voice in your head. Not to fight it, not to silence it, but simply to see it for what it is. A thought is just a thought. It is not the truth. Once you realize this, the power of worry begins to loosen. Think of an old monk sitting by a river. A young student runs up out of breath, saying, "Master, I'm so afraid. My future, my family, my health, everything feels uncertain." The monk points to the flowing water and says, "Look at the river. Do you see how it moves, always changing, never the same twice? Your fears are like this water. They appear, they pass. They are not solid, they are not you." This is where the journey begins, not in trying to erase worry instantly, but in learning to see it as moving water, not a permanent truth. Once you stop clinging to every thought, you start to feel space inside, space where peace can grow. And maybe you felt that before, those rare moments when, despite your problems, you looked at the sunset or listened to a bird's song or took a slow, deep breath. For a brief second, worry was gone. You weren't trying to solve everything. You were simply present. That is the taste of freedom the Buddha spoke about. But of course, the mind will wander again. It will pull you back into what-ifs and should-haves. That's natural. The practice is not about perfection, it's about returning. Returning again and again to that deeper awareness until one day you no longer identify yourself with the battlefield. You become the calm witness who watches the battle untouched. This path is not easy. It takes courage to face the storm inside. It takes patience to sit with discomfort instead of running from it. But every great journey starts with this step, seeing clearly that the enemy is not life itself. It is the unchecked mind that tells you life is unbearable. And once you see this, something begins to shift. You realize that freedom is possible. Peace is not somewhere far away. It is right here, waiting beneath the noise. So let's take this first step together. Let's look at the mind with honesty and compassion, not as a problem to destroy, but as a space to understand. Because once you understand, worry loses its grip, and wisdom begins to shine through. And as we move deeper, a powerful realization emerges. If our thoughts are not always the truth, then perhaps we don't have to obey them blindly. Perhaps we can find a new way to relate to them, a way that leads us closer to peace instead of deeper into fear. The mind never stops talking. Even when the world around you is silent, Inside your head, there is a constant stream of words, images, and judgments. It tells you stories about who you are, what might happen, and how badly things could go. It whispers, it shouts, it argues, and sometimes it terrifies you. But here's the secret most people never realize. Just because you have a thought doesn't mean it's true. Think about how many times your mind predicted disaster that never came. How many nights you stayed awake worrying about tomorrow, only to discover the day passed more gently than you expected. Yet in those sleepless hours, the fear felt real. Why? Because you believed the thought. You treated it as truth instead of what it really was, just mental weather passing through. The Buddha compared the mind to a monkey, leaping from branch to branch, restless and uncontrolled. A monkey doesn't sit still, it grabs whatever catches its eye. Our mind is the same. It grabs worries from the past, fears from the future, and throws them into our lap as if they were facts. But we forget that these are only fragments, shadows, not reality itself. Imagine standing on a busy street corner at night. Cars rush by, their headlights flashing. You could mistake the shadows on the walls for something frightening, ghostly figures, monsters lurking. But in truth, they are just passing lights, illusions created by movement. Thoughts are like those shadows. They appear convincing, but when you look closer, there's nothing solid behind them. This is why mindfulness is so powerful. It trains us to step back and see, this is a thought, not the truth, just a thought. That single recognition is freedom. Because the moment you realize a thought is not reality, it loses its ability to control you. Consider this: if a stranger walked up to you and said, "You are worthless," you would probably dismiss them. You'd recognize they don't know you and their words don't define you. Yet when your own mind whispers the same thing, you accept it without question. Why? Because you assume it's my thought, so it must be true. But no. The mind is simply repeating old patterns, old conditioning, echoes of fears picked up long ago. The practice then is to become the witness, to notice when a thought arises and say, "Here is worry, here is fear, here is self-doubt." Just naming it breaks the spell. Suddenly you see it as an event in consciousness, not as who you are. There's a story of a Zen student who complained to his master, "My mind is full of terrible thoughts, I can't stop them." The master smiled and replied, "Do not worry about the birds that fly over your head. Only make sure they do not build a nest in your hair. Thoughts will always come and go. You cannot stop the birds from flying, but you don't have to let them settle, build a nest, and control your life." So when worry arises, don't fight it. Don't believe it. Don't feed it. Just notice. A bird passing by, that's all, and the bird will keep flying. In daily life, this practice can be simple. You feel a surge of anxiety before an important meeting. Instead of spiraling into, "I'll fail, they'll laugh, I'll lose everything," you pause, you take a breath. You silently say, "This is just a thought, it's not reality." In that moment, a gap opens. A gap where calmness can enter. That gap is the key, because within that space, you're no longer a prisoner of your own mind. You realize you have a choice, to believe the thought or to let it drift away. And the more you practice, the more natural it becomes. You stop being dragged by every wave of thought. You begin to stand in the stillness beneath the waves. And here's something beautiful. Once you stop believing every thought, you also stop believing every worry about the future. You discover that the present moment, right here, right now, is usually safe, usually enough. It is the mind's projections into the future that create panic, not the actual moment you're living in. So as we walk deeper into this journey, a realization begins to dawn. If thoughts are not the truth, then perhaps the way to freedom is not to chase them, but to return again and again to the only thing that is real, the present moment. When the storm of thoughts begins to quiet, when you finally realize that not every thought deserves your belief, something beautiful becomes possible. You can return home. And home is not a distant place, not a memory, not even a dream of the future. Home is here in this very moment, waiting for you. The present moment is often underestimated. We think of it as too ordinary, too simple. The mind prefers drama, the regrets of yesterday, the fantasies and fears of tomorrow. But the present moment is the only place where life is truly alive. Right here, right now, your breath is moving in and out. Your heart is beating, the world is unfolding, and yet most of the time we miss it. We are lost in the past or trapped in the future. The Buddha once said, "Do not dwell in the past, do not dream of the future, concentrate the mind on the present moment." It sounds simple, but to actually live this way is the deepest practice. Think of the last time you were fully present. Maybe it was watching a sunset, holding a child's hand, or listening to the rain fall softly outside your window. For that brief moment, there was no worry, no fear. Time seemed to stop. That is the power of presence. But why is it so hard to stay there? Because the mind is addicted to movement. It constantly pulls you out of the now with stories. What's next? What if this? What about that? The practice of returning to the present is like gently training a wild horse. You don't punish it, you don't force it, you guide it back over and over until it learns to rest. One of the simplest tools for returning is the breath. The breath is always here. It doesn't belong to yesterday or tomorrow. Every inhale, every exhale anchors you to now. When you feel lost in thought, place your attention on the breath. Feel the air enter your nose, fill your lungs, leave your body. Nothing more, just this. Another way is through the senses. Notice the colors around you. Listen to the subtle sounds you usually ignore, the hum of the fan, the rustle of leaves, the distant murmur of life outside. Touch something close to you and really feel its texture. These small acts pull you out of the endless chatter in your head and drop you back into the vividness of reality. Zen masters often point to ordinary actions as gateways to presence. Sweeping the floor, drinking tea, walking down a path. All can be moments of awakening if done with full awareness. Thich Nh letter 1ea5t H letter 1ea1nh once said, "When you wash the dishes, wash the dishes." It sounds strange, almost too obvious. But think of how often you wash dishes while planning tomorrow's work or replaying yesterday's argument. You miss the miracle of warm water, the scent of soap, the act itself. Returning to the present transforms even the simplest task into a meditation. And here's the profound part. When you are truly present, worry cannot survive. Worry feeds on the future. Regret feeds on the past. In the now, they dissolve. That's why the present moment is not just peaceful, it's powerful. It cuts through illusions and reveals reality as it is. But let's be honest, living in the present doesn't mean ignoring real responsibilities. It doesn't mean saying, "I'll never think about the future." It means that when you do think about tomorrow, you do it consciously without being enslaved by fear. You use thought as a tool, not as a master. So the practice is simple. Every time you notice you've been pulled into worry, gently return. Not with judgment, not with frustration, but with kindness. "Ah, I've drifted away. Let me come back." Each return is a victory. Each return strengthens your ability to live here, where life is unfolding. Imagine your mind like a traveler who keeps wandering off into strange lands. The present moment is the home it always leaves behind. But no matter how many times it strays, you can always guide it back. And the more often you return, the more natural home begins to feel. And slowly something shifts. You start to notice joy in small things again. The way sunlight falls across the floor, the laughter of a child, the taste of your morning tea. These are not trivial details, they are life itself. You realize you don't have to wait for happiness. It's already here, hidden in plain sight in the ordinary present moment. And as you taste this simplicity, another truth emerges. Peace is not something to be found in the future. Peace is something you create by returning again and again to the reality of now. The more we return to the present, the more a difficult truth begins to reveal itself. So much of our suffering comes from trying to control what cannot be controlled. Think about how often we wrestle with life as if we could bend it to our will. We try to control how others see us. We try to control outcomes, the weather, our health, even the passage of time. And when things don't follow our script, as they rarely do, we feel frustration, disappointment, and pain. But what if the very idea of control is an illusion? What if life was never meant to be grasped, never meant to be forced into our plan but simply lived as it unfolds. Consider this. You can plan every detail of a day, but one phone call, one unexpected event can change everything. You can eat healthy, exercise daily, yet still face illness. You can love someone with your whole heart and they may still leave. None of these outcomes are fully within your power, and yet we live as if they were, exhausting ourselves in a fight we cannot win. The Buddha taught that clinging is the root of suffering, and clinging is exactly what control is, a desperate attempt to hold on to the fleeting, the changing, the uncontrollable. It is like trying to grasp water in your hands. The tighter you squeeze, the faster it slips away. But letting go of control doesn't mean giving up on life. It doesn't mean apathy or carelessness. It means shifting from control to cooperation. Instead of fighting the current, you learn to flow with it. Instead of demanding certainty, you learn to trust uncertainty. Think of a sailor on the ocean. He cannot control the wind. He cannot control the waves, but he can adjust his sails. He can steer with awareness, responding to what is, not clinging to what he wishes it to be. That is wisdom. That is freedom. So much anxiety comes from the illusion that if we just tried harder, worried more, or planned perfectly, life would obey us. But look closely, has that ever truly worked? Worry does not prevent tomorrow's problems, it only steals today's peace. Control is an illusion, but awareness is real. Presence is real. Choice in each moment is real. Zen teachers often speak of allowing things to be as they are. This doesn't mean passivity. It means meeting reality with open eyes instead of fighting it with resistance. When you accept that you cannot control the storm, you can finally learn how to dance in the rain. Letting go of control is an act of trust. Trust in life. Trust in the unfolding of things beyond your view. Trust that even in uncertainty, you have the strength to respond, to adapt, to keep walking. And maybe you've already felt this. Think of a time when something didn't go as planned, yet in the end, it brought you to a place you never expected, perhaps even a place better than the one you imagined. Life has a way of surprising us when we stop forcing it. The truth is, the need for control comes from fear. Fear of loss, fear of failure, fear of the unknown. But the more you cling, the more fear grows, and the more you release, the more peace you find. This is why meditation, mindfulness, and Buddhist practice are not about controlling the mind, but about observing it. Not about controlling life, but about awakening to it. When you see clearly, you don't need to control everything. You simply meet life as it is with calmness and compassion. And here lies the paradox. When you stop trying to control life, you actually begin to live it more fully. You become lighter, freer, more alive. You realize that your real power was never in controlling outcomes, but in how you respond to them. So perhaps the invitation is not to tighten your grip, but to soften it. Not to command life, but to listen to it. Not to force, but to flow. And as this truth sinks in, a new question arises. If control is an illusion, and if letting go is the path to peace, then why do we cling so tightly to worry? Why do we continue feeding the very thoughts that harm us? Once we begin to see through the illusion of control, another truth becomes clear. Suffering is not the enemy. It is the teacher. Every human life, no matter how carefully lived, will encounter pain, loss, failure, sickness, disappointment. We spend so much energy running from these experiences, trying to build a life where suffering cannot touch us. But Buddhism reminds us that pain is unavoidable. The question is not, how do I escape suffering? The real question is, what will I do with it when it comes? You see, suffering can crush us or it can awaken us. It can harden the heart or it can break it open. The choice is ours. The Buddha himself began his journey because of suffering. He saw sickness, old age, and death, and instead of turning away, he turned inward, searching for a truth deeper than pain. And from his search came wisdom that continues to guide us centuries later. Think for a moment about your own life. Some of your deepest insights, your strongest growth, likely came not from moments of comfort, but from moments of difficulty. When the relationship ended, you learned the depth of your resilience. When the dream collapsed, you discovered new paths. When you faced loss, you came to understand the fragile beauty of every breath, every moment. Suffering refines us if we allow it to. It strips away illusions, showing us what really matters. When you've walked through pain, suddenly small annoyances lose their power. You no longer waste energy on trivialities because you've touched something raw, something real. But here's the key. Transformation doesn't happen automatically. Pain alone does not guarantee wisdom. Some people go through suffering and become bitter, closed, angry. Others go through the same suffering and emerge compassionate, humble, wise. The difference lies in how we meet the pain. If we resist suffering, if we say, "This shouldn't be happening to me, I don't deserve this," we add another layer of pain on top of the pain that's already there. But if we can meet suffering with awareness, with acceptance, then something shifts. Instead of asking, "Why me?" we begin to ask, "What can this teach me?" This shift is everything. Suddenly, the wound becomes a doorway. The darkness becomes a teacher. There is a Zen saying, "Obstacles do not block the path, they are the path." That means your suffering is not a detour from life. It is part of life's curriculum, an invitation to grow. So how do we transform suffering into wisdom? The first step is to stop running. Sit with it, feel it, acknowledge it fully. Let the tears fall if they must. This is not weakness, it is honesty, and honesty opens the door to healing. The second step is to look deeply. Ask yourself, what is this pain revealing about me, about the world, about what I cling to? Often suffering exposes attachments, things we thought we couldn't live without. But when they are taken, we discover we are still here, still breathing, still capable of love. The third step is to let suffering soften the heart. When you know what it feels like to hurt, you can no longer look at another person's pain with indifference. Compassion grows. Suddenly, you are gentler with others because you understand the weight they might be carrying. And finally, the fourth step is to use suffering as fuel. Instead of letting it paralyze you, let it motivate you. Turn grief into gratitude. Turn loss into clarity. Turn fear into courage. This is alchemy, the spiritual art of transforming suffering into wisdom. Think of the lotus flower, one of Buddhism's most powerful symbols. It blooms in muddy water. Without the mud, there would be no lotus. The mud is suffering, the lotus is wisdom. The two are inseparable. So the next time life brings you pain, remember this. It is not here to destroy you. It is here to awaken you, to strip away illusions, to show you the strength you didn't know you had, to connect you more deeply with the suffering of others, and to remind you that wisdom is not found in avoiding pain, but in transforming it. And when you begin to live this way, suffering loses its sting. It becomes less of an enemy and more of a guide. You realize that even in darkness, something luminous is waiting to be discovered. Which brings us to a profound realization. If suffering can be transformed into wisdom, then perhaps even our deepest worries, our darkest fears, hold within them the seeds of freedom. The very thing we run from might be the key to awakening. When suffering begins to shape itself into wisdom, one of the first lessons it whispers is this: not everything in life deserves a reaction. We live in a world that constantly pulls at us. Words, opinions, judgments, unexpected events. The instinct is to respond immediately, to defend ourselves, to fight back, to prove something. But here's the truth. Not every arrow that's shot in your direction needs to be caught. Some arrows are better left to fall to the ground. Think of how much energy we waste reacting to things that don't matter. Someone cuts you off in traffic, and suddenly your whole day feels ruined. A colleague makes a careless remark, and you replay it in your mind for hours. A stranger on the internet leaves a comment, and you lose sleep over it. These are small sparks, but when we feed them with our reactions, they ignite into wildfires that burn away our peace. Buddhism teaches us that craving and aversion are the roots of suffering. Reactivity is a form of aversion. We push against what we dislike. But every reaction ties us tighter to the very thing we want to escape. By reacting, we give power away. By pausing, we reclaim it. Imagine standing at the edge of a still pond. If you throw stones into the water, ripples distort the reflection. But if you remain calm, the surface stays clear, and reality can be seen for what it is. Your mind works the same way. The less you react, the clearer you see. Zen masters often remind us, silence is also a response. Choosing not to react is not weakness, it is mastery. Anyone can lash out in anger. Anyone can get lost in drama. But it takes strength to stay still, to breathe, to decide with wisdom instead of impulse. Let's make this practical. The next time someone says something hurtful, notice the fire rising in your chest. Instead of throwing that fire back, pause, breathe, ask yourself, does this truly deserve my energy, or can I let it pass? You'll be surprised how many battles dissolve on their own when you refuse to fight. This doesn't mean you never respond. There are times when action is necessary, when boundaries must be drawn, when truth must be spoken. But wisdom lies in discernment, the ability to know what deserves your voice and what deserves your silence. And here's the liberating truth. When you stop reacting to everything, you discover a new kind of freedom. The world no longer controls you. People's words lose their chains. Situations lose their grip. You move through life with calmness, like a mountain unmoved by the passing storm. Think of the Buddha sitting beneath the Bodhi tree. Legends say that as he meditated, Mara, the embodiment of illusion, sent armies of demons to frighten him, temptations to seduce him, doubts to shake him. But the Buddha did not react. He simply touched the earth, grounded in presence, and all illusions dissolved. This is the power of non-reaction. Every time you choose not to react, you are training your mind, you are strengthening your inner stillness, and slowly life begins to shift. What used to throw you into chaos no longer controls you. What used to steal your peace now becomes just another passing cloud. And perhaps the most beautiful part, when you stop reacting, you begin responding instead. A reaction comes from impulse. A response comes from wisdom. A reaction is immediate, often fueled by ego. A response is thoughtful, guided by awareness. And that small shift can change everything, not only in your life, but in the lives of those around you. So the invitation is this: guard your energy. Not everything deserves a reaction. Let go of the small battles. Save your strength for what truly matters. And watch as peace, the kind of peace that no one can take from you, begins to grow. And yet, if we look deeper, we must ask, why do we feel so compelled to react in the first place? Why does the ego demand to be heard, defended, proven right? Perhaps the answer lies in our relationship with the self, with the identity we cling to so tightly. The more we learn to stop reacting to every little disturbance, the more space we create inside. And in that stillness, a new realization emerges. Maybe our problems are not obstacles after all. Maybe they are the path itself. Think about it. Every challenge you've ever faced has shaped you into who you are right now. The moments of ease rarely change us. It is the struggles, the difficulties, the trials that force us to grow, to stretch beyond what we thought possible. The mind loves to label things as good or bad, fortunate or unfortunate. But life is far more mysterious than those labels allow. What looks like a problem today may turn out to be the very thing that saves you tomorrow. What seems like a setback might be the foundation for a future strength. There's an old Zen story about a farmer whose horse ran away. The neighbors came and said, "How terrible," but the farmer simply replied, "Maybe." A few days later, the horse returned, bringing with it several wild horses. The neighbors said, "How wonderful." Again, the farmer said, "Maybe." Soon after, the farmer's son broke his leg while trying to tame one of the horses. The neighbors cried, "How awful." The farmer simply said, "Maybe." Later, soldiers came to the village to recruit young men for war, but because his son's leg was broken, he was spared. The neighbors said, "How lucky." And again, the farmer whispered, "Maybe." The point is simple. Problems are not always what they seem. What we call bad luck may contain hidden blessings. What we call trouble may be the doorway to freedom. When we reframe problems this way, they lose some of their weight. Instead of asking, "Why is this happening to me?" we begin asking, "How is this shaping me? What can I learn here? Where might this lead?" It's not about pretending suffering doesn't hurt. It does. But when we shift perspective, pain is no longer wasted. It becomes compost for growth. Think of a seed buried in the dark soil. To the seed, it might feel like a problem, pressure, weight, darkness. But that very struggle is what allows it to break open and grow into something magnificent. Without the soil, without the struggle, there is no tree, no flower, no fruit. Your problems work the same way. They press on you, yes, but they also invite you to break open, to stretch, to rise. And here's the paradox. When we resist our problems, we suffer twice, once from the problem itself, and once from our refusal to accept it. But when we embrace the problem as part of the path, the suffering softens. We stop asking life to be easy, and instead we start asking ourselves to be strong. This doesn't mean we should go out looking for pain. Life will bring enough on its own. It simply means that when problems come, we no longer see them as detours but as part of the road itself. Imagine walking a mountain trail. You come across rocks, steep climbs, muddy patches. They slow you down, test your strength, sometimes make you stumble, but they are still part of the path. Without them, you would never reach the summit. And when you finally stand at the top, looking out at the vast horizon, every struggle feels worth it. When we reframe problems in this way, gratitude begins to grow. Gratitude not only for the joys, but also for the struggles, because both are shaping us into who we are meant to become. So perhaps the next time life throws a problem your way, you can pause and whisper, "This too is part of the path." And with that shift, a burden becomes a teacher, and the road beneath your feet begins to feel a little lighter. But of course, if problems can be reframed as part of the path, then the real question becomes, how do we walk this path with steadiness? How do we keep our hearts calm even when life throws storms our way? If problems are part of the path, then fear is often the shadow that walks beside them. Fear of failure, fear of loss, fear of the unknown, fear of not being enough. But here's the truth, fear is not the enemy, it is a natural response of the mind trying to protect us. The real question is, will we let fear become a prison, or will we find the courage to cross beyond it? This is where faith enters. Faith is not blind belief. Faith is trust. Trust that life has meaning, even when you can't see it. Trust that you carry more strength within you than you realize. Trust that the storms will pass, and even if they don't, you will still find your way through them. Think of faith as a bridge. On one side stands fear, heavy and paralyzing. On the other side lies freedom, clarity, and peace. The bridge between them is faith, not because it removes the fear, but because it gives you the courage to walk forward in spite of it. The Buddha never promised a life without fear. What he offered was a path where fear no longer ruled the heart. Through mindfulness, we learn to see fear for what it is, a passing wave in the ocean of the mind. And with faith, we learn to ride that wave instead of drowning in it. Faith is what allows you to take the first step even when the road ahead is unclear. It whispers. You don't need to know how the story ends. You only need to walk the part of the path that is right in front of you. Think about the times in your life when you were afraid but still moved forward. Perhaps you started a new job, ended a relationship, spoke a difficult truth, or took a risk that changed everything. Looking back, wasn't it those moments when fear was present but faith carried you that shaped your destiny? In Zen, there is a teaching that says, leap and the net will appear. It doesn't mean life will always catch you the way you want, but it does mean that once you leap with faith, life responds. New doors open, inner strength awakens, and even if you fall, you rise stronger than before. Faith is not about certainty, it is about courage. Courage to trust the unfolding of life. Courage to walk into the unknown without needing to control it. Courage to believe that no matter how dark the night, the dawn will come. And perhaps most importantly, faith is not only trust in life, but trust in yourself. You are more resilient than you think. You are more capable than you realize. Fear says you can't. Faith says you will find a way. When you begin to live with faith, fear loses its grip. It may still whisper, but it no longer dictates your choices. Instead, you move with a quiet strength, knowing that whatever comes, you will meet it with presence and courage. So when fear rises, and it will, don't fight it and don't let it paralyze you. Step onto the bridge of faith. Trust the path. Trust yourself. Trust that even the unknown has something to teach you. And as you walk with this trust, you'll begin to notice something extraordinary. Fear that once felt overwhelming becomes lighter, softer, even manageable. Because faith doesn't erase fear, it transforms it into a stepping stone. And with every step you take across that bridge, you are walking closer to the deepest freedom a human being can know. Which leads us to a profound realization. If faith gives us the courage to walk through fear, then perhaps the true measure of power is not force, not control, but calmness, the ability to remain steady no matter what storms arise. Faith may give us the courage to step across fear, but what sustains us once we're on the other side is wisdom. And wisdom, unlike fleeting bursts of inspiration, is not something reserved for monks in monasteries or sages on mountaintops. Wisdom is meant to be lived, step by step, in the ordinary rhythm of daily life. So what does it mean to walk with wisdom? It begins with awareness. Awareness of how you speak, how you act, how you think. Wisdom is not a grand philosophy locked in books. It's the way you treat the cashier at the grocery store, the way you speak to your family when you're tired, the way you hold yourself in moments when no one is watching. In Buddhism, there is a teaching called right view, seeing life clearly, without the fog of distortion. When you carry right view into daily life, you stop taking everything so personally. You recognize that people's words and actions often come from their own suffering, and instead of reacting with anger, you respond with understanding. Walking with wisdom means you start to notice the small choices that shape your day. Do you let stress dictate your tone of voice? Do you allow impatience to poison your interactions? Or do you pause, breathe, and bring presence into even the simplest acts? Drinking tea, washing dishes, listening to a friend. One drop of wisdom applied in a single moment can change the entire flow of a day. There's a saying, before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. The tasks don't change. The difference is in how you approach them. With wisdom, the ordinary becomes sacred. Washing a bowl becomes an act of mindfulness. Walking down the street becomes a meditation. Speaking becomes an opportunity to plant seeds of kindness. Wisdom in daily life is also about remembering what truly matters. So often, we get lost chasing things that do not last: possessions, status, approval. But when we walk with wisdom, we carry a quiet awareness that everything is temporary. This awareness softens our grip. We stop clinging so tightly to what we can't keep, and instead we begin to value what endures: compassion, integrity, presence, love. Walking with wisdom also means learning to simplify. Life becomes lighter when you let go of unnecessary burdens, grudges, resentments, endless comparisons. You don't need to win every argument, own every shiny thing, or be admired by every person. You simply need to walk with clarity, knowing your steps are aligned with truth. And here's the beauty. Wisdom is not something you have to go searching for in distant places. It already lives within you. Every time you pause before speaking harshly, you are walking with wisdom. Every time you choose patience instead of frustration, you are walking with wisdom. Every time you notice your breath and return to the present, you are walking with wisdom. The more you practice, the more natural it becomes. Wisdom stops being something you remember to do and slowly becomes the way you move through life. And when you walk with wisdom in daily life, people feel it. They may not know why, but they sense a steadiness in you, a calmness that cannot be shaken easily. Your presence itself becomes a gift, a reminder to others that there is another way to live. Because ultimately, wisdom is not about escaping the world. It's about engaging with it more deeply, more kindly, more fully awake. And so, as we near the end of this journey, we must ask, what is it all pointing to? What is the ultimate lesson hidden beneath the battlefield of the mind, the silence beyond reaction, the courage of faith, and the daily steps of wisdom? The answer lies in the closing chapter. A reminder that all of this is not just philosophy, but a way of living, a way of being, a way of returning home to yourself. And so we arrive at the quiet close of this journey. We began on the battlefield of the mind, where worry often rises like an uninvited storm. We walked through the illusions of thought, the power of presence, the weight of suffering transformed into wisdom, the freedom that comes when we no longer react to everything, and the steady trust that carries us across fear. Step by step, we discovered that peace is not somewhere far away. It is here in this very moment, waiting for us to notice. From worry to peace, it is not a straight line, it is a practice. Some days the mind will still be noisy. Some days fear will still return. But with each breath, with each choice to respond with awareness instead of reaction, you are walking the path of wisdom. You are teaching your heart to rest in stillness, no matter how loud the world becomes. Peace is not the absence of problems. Peace is the presence of understanding. When you see life clearly, when you learn to trust the unfolding, when you remember that even struggles have meaning, then peace becomes your natural state. And perhaps that is the greatest teaching of all. You do not need to wait for perfect circumstances to be at peace. You can be at peace right now in the midst of it all, simply by choosing to return to yourself. Take a slow breath. Let it remind you, you are here, you are alive, and this moment is enough. If these words have touched something within you, carry them with you into your daily life. And if this journey has resonated with your heart, I invite you to stay connected with us. Subscribe to Zen Buddhism Wisdom for more teachings, more stories, more reminders of the path that leads from worry to peace. Each video is a small offering, a candle lit in the vast night, so that together we may walk with more clarity, more compassion, and more calm. Until we meet again, may your steps be steady, your heart be light, and your mind be at peace.